pleasure to introduce Dr. Griffioen. Dr. Griffioen was educated in Iowa, the University of Iowa. Is now the Margareta von Rangel Fellow at the University of Constance. She's published on the most remarkable range of subjects, from superstition in baseball, the irrationality of self-deception, divine and civil law in Abelard, the things I found on there. And is going to talk to us today about recovering Compassio, suffering, struggle, and Theodicy as therapy. So if you'll join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much, and thank you both to the Humane Philosophy Project and the Ian Ramsey Center for inviting me to be here today. It's not often that one gets to drink wine and hold forth on philosophy of religion at the same time, so this could be fun. Right, so we'll get right down to it. Can everybody hear me okay? We're all right? Great. If I have to cough in the middle of this, please forgive me. I'm recovering from a pretty bad cold, so there may be a few coughing fits throughout. Just ignore them, carry on. Okay, so to begin, I want to say a few words about the context of my talk and kind of what kind of trouble I plan to get into today. So the title of the lecture series, of which this talk is supposed to be a part, at least as I understand it, is God, Good, and Evil in a Scientific Age. Now, the classical question in philosophy of religion to which this kind of topic tends to give rise is something along the lines of how we can square the idea of a perfectly good God with the fact that there seems to be a whole bunch of evil in the world. Especially when viewed from the standpoint of a society that finds itself in a so-called scientific age. Now, I have to be a little honest here. I don't exactly know what is meant by a scientific age and whether or not we actually live in one. I'm inclined to think that for better or for worse, probably for worse, we don't. But I think what is generally understood by this term is something along the lines of like a modern, enlightened age, an age of reason and evidence and facts, hence the reason I'm not sure that we live in such an age. But viewed from this perspective, the question of God, good, and evil is a question whose very formulation tends to set up an antagonism between science, kind of the modern champion of reason on the one side, and religion, the supposed vestige or inheritance of superstition and irrationality on the other. And regardless of whether this polarization is fair or not, notice what this way of setting up the discourse actually does. First, it not only assumes that Enlightenment values, with a focus on evidence, rationality, proof, and correctness, are the right and perhaps highest values a society should adopt. It also places the discussion of God, good, and evil almost exclusively in the realm of the cognitive. That is, debates about religion become debates about religious propositions and whether or not it is epistemically justified or all things considered reasonable to believe in a good God, especially given the fact of human suffering, whether it be the result of moral evil inflicted by other human beings or natural evils like hurricanes, mudslides, illnesses, and the like. Now, personally, I think to reduce science and religion to mere systems of belief which compete against each other to make sense or give meaning to the world, its origins, and its functions, does a disservice to both science and religion. I also think that restricting the domain of analytic philosophy of religion to defending the rationality of religious belief, or perhaps better put, to defending the rationality of a propositional theology of the form commonly called perfect being theology or classical theism, is ultimately to limit what philosophy of religion can and maybe even should be. In fact, it removes the object of study of philosophy of religion, namely religion, so far from actual lived religion, or religion on the ground, as it were, as to make it almost unrecognizable from the religious standpoint itself. And put in my most scientific vocabulary, that's a real bummer for the discipline. But all humor aside, this way of understanding philosophy of religion, that is, as a fundamentally epistemological and metaphysical enterprise engaged in defending the rationality of classical theism, has very real consequences in the real world. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So to a certain extent, I'm going to approach the question of God, good, and evil in a scientific age from a more meta-philosophical perspective. I want to talk about the very way that how the very way that we formulate this question and the traditional strategy of response in the form of so-called theodicies, or justifications of God, might turn out to be harmful, both to those who actually undergo significant suffering and to those of us who think about these questions in philosophy of religion. So, okay, enough by way of introduction. What do we have on the docket in the next 45 minutes or so? Well, first I want to run through the ways that the so-called classical problem of evil tends to be formulated in analytic philosophy of religion with respect to human suffering, and to briefly run through some of the main theodicies and defenses presented by philosophers and theologians, both historically and today. If you've had Philosophy of Religion 101, this will most likely be a bit of a review for you. But it's good to get it out on the table so we know kind of how the discourse tends to proceed. I'm then going to move on to discuss some so-called anti-theodical objections to this very way of proceeding in philosophy and theology, and argue that theodicies of these kinds have the potential to do more harm than good. We'll talk a little bit more about what I think we're actually doing when we conduct the discussion in this way, and then discuss an alternative suggestion, a proposal for reappropriating the term theodicy in a way that better promotes the well-being of those who suffer, and which gives those of us in positions of privilege the tools to stand with them in solidarity and fight to relieve that suffering where we can. So let's start with the classical problem of evil. There are two primary formulations of the problem that tend to receive extended discussion in the philosophy of religion discourse. These are commonly known as the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. You guys know this, right? The logical problem, as its name suggests, proposes that there is some sort of logical incompatibility or inconsistency in postulating the existence of a perfectly good, all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God, and there being the kind of evil we find in the world. On this view, the presence of gratuitous evil makes it literally impossible that a perfect being exists. Notice, however, that to address this problem, the theists need really only show that it's conceivable or logically possible that the evil we find in the world is consistent with there being some divine being with the properties of omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and so on. That is, to counter such arguments, the theist doesn't really have to show that there is such a God, only to tell a story that could, as Peter van Inwagen puts it, be true for all we know about some relevantly near possible world in which such evil is not gratuitous, or in which such gratuitous evil is not incompatible with the existence of such a God. Such for all we know responses are commonly called defenses in the literature. The burden of proof, however, for the theist at least, is heavier when we turn to the so-called evidential problem of evil. Here the claim is that the presence of the kind of evil we find in the world provides strong evidence or makes it significantly more unlikely that a perfect being exists. Now this is somewhat of a weaker claim, but in some sense it's actually more difficult for the theist to counter in that she now has to at least show that such evil does not make it more unlikely than not in this world that God does not exist. And it's here that we tend to find most of what we might call theodicies proper, namely claims about what God, the world, and evil must be like to counter the evidential force presented by the existence of actual evil. A theodicy, on its face, then, tries to justify God in the face of what we perceive as evil. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways to cash out these two versions of the problem of evil, depending on the kind of evil you focus on and how you divide up the terrain. Do we want to make a distinction between moral, natural, and metaphysical evils like Leibniz does? Do we want to focus on radical or horrendous evils such as rape, genocide, or cancer, or on everyday ills such as headaches, fatigue? Are we going to talk about just humans or also animals, and so on? Right? For our purposes today, I want to focus primarily on the problem as formulated with respect to human suffering, and more specifically on the kinds of traumatic suffering that result from what Marilyn McCord Adams called horrendous evils, or, quote, evils the doing or suffering of which gives one reason prima facie to doubt whether one's life could, given their inclusion in such evil, be a great good to one on the whole. For it is with respect to those that undergo such traumatic suffering that I think what we call the theodical approach is especially harmful. However, I think my argument can be extended to less traumatic instances of suffering and even perhaps animal suffering. Still, it will suffice to think about the extreme case because if we have good reason to think that such methodological philosophical approaches create more harm than they alleviate, for these persons, this alone might be enough to count against such an approach, especially from within Christianity and other religious traditions that emphasize things like love of neighbor, alleviation of suffering, and justice for the oppressed as central tenets. Okay, so let's look briefly at a few of the leading kind of theodicies and defenses that we see in the literature and see what they have to say with respect to the suffering of horrendous evils. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worth mentioning kind of what's out there. So first we have what I like to call the it's our fault approach. There's various versions of this, right? One is to understand human suffering as a punitive notion. So human suffering as punishment for sin. We do the evil, evil is moral evil, even natural evils perhaps are the result of our just being jerks, right? On the other side, we also have so-called free will defenses that don't necessarily see evil as divine punishment, but rather as more like the logical or metaphysical consequence of using free will badly. So in some of these views like that presented by Plantinga, you get this idea that a world with free will is better than a world without free will, but inevitably or not, depending on who you ask, we misuse our free will, and that gives rise to suffering as the result of those evils. Then we have what I like to call the big picture scenarios. So these are kind of your best of all possible world strategies, right, of Leibniz et alia. So the idea that God being the kind of creature that being the kind of being that God is, creates, perhaps necessarily, the best of all possible worlds. That's our world, as it turns out. And if you could step back and kind of see the big picture, you would see how all these bits of suffering fall into place, and that this is, in fact, a better world than all other possible worlds. Now, this is a bit of a straw man, but you get the idea, right? Then we have what I call small picture scenarios, or smaller picture at least than best of all possible world scenarios, though they're not incompatible with big picture views. Here I include things like soul-making theodicies, such as that of John Hick, in which evil and suffering creates opportunities for second-order goods, for cultivating certain kinds of virtues, right? You can't have courage if there's nothing to be afraid of. You can't be generous if everybody has everything that they need, right? And so suffering and evil create opportunities to make us more perfect, more Christ-like, and also to allow us to enter into the kinds of relationships with the divine that we ought to be in. Relationships are also central to so-called divine intimacy theodicies by, as represented by Marilyn McCord Adams and others. It's also something that I think is prevalent in a lot of the medieval mystical literature that I'm dealing with, Henry Suso. I was really excited to do a paper on Suso and Theodicy, and then first of all, he gives all of these theodicies, and then you get, the hardcore suffering is a gift of God, and God is absent when I'm not suffering, and It's highly problematic, but there's definitely something like a divine intimacy theodicy going on here, that suffering gives us at least opportunities. Perhaps it represents the best way in which we can imitate the humanity of Christ and enter into intimate relationship with God. And then there's skeptical theism. Now again, this is going to be a bit of a straw man, but roughly speaking, skeptical theism says that our cognitive capacities, if there is a God of the kind represented in classical theism, we should expect that our cognitive capacities with respect to that being are significantly limited, such that we could not understand that being, neither could we understand that being's reasons. And thus, it kind of cautions that we should be epistemically humble, but presumes that God does, in fact, have reasons that are just somehow kind of beyond our ken. All right, so notice that in each of these scenarios, the assumption is that the evil in question is not straightforwardly gratuitous, right? It is transformed into a necessary evil, or at least an evil without which certain goods could not or otherwise would not arise. Thus, although the suffering that results from such evils is unfortunate, in theodicy it is transmuted into either a necessary byproduct or a beneficial condition towards some greater good that is served by the presence of evil in the world. Even in the case of skeptical theism, which does not itself provide a reason for justifying God, the understanding here is that if we occupied the God's eye perspective, we would be in possession of such a reason, or at least that's how I understand the skeptical theist view. Okay, but what is it that philosophers of religion are really doing when they provide such theodicies? What is being accomplished by these endeavors? So here I want to take a little foray into speech act theory and J.L. Austin, as well as kind of the later development and incorporation of these ideas into discussions of performativity. The idea, very roughly, is that we do things with words when we speak, right? This sounds pretty obvious. But what we do by making certain utterances is not always immediately clear just by looking at like the content of my locutionary act, of the things that I say, right? So we have what are called illocutionary acts, which Austin talks about as those acts that are performed by my uttering of certain locutions. So for example, this may depend on context. Take the locution knife, right? Now when I say knife, I may simply be describing the world, as in, hey, there's a knife, right? But if I'm a doctor performing surgery, I may be requesting that a nurse hand me the knife, right? Scalpel, rib spreader, knife, right? Or if I'm in a rumble between the Jets and the Sharks, I may yell out, knife, as a warning that a member of the opposing side is brandishing a weapon. Locutionary acts also have what Austin calls perlocutionary effects, or the actual consequences that engaging in the speech act has on and for others, whether intended or not. So when someone says, I do in a marriage ceremony, there's a picture from my wedding last year in the Konstanzer Münster. So when someone says, I do in a marriage ceremony, and thereby performs the illocutionary act of marrying their partner, this act of promising creates an expectation in the partner that the former is now committed to the latter in a certain way. It may also, intentionally or unintentionally, please or displease the family of the bride or groom. It might disappoint a potential suitor. It may even conveniently distract a nation from its other problems. Or, to take another example, I hope that the illocutionary act of arguing for my view today, which is performed via my giving this talk, has the perlocutionary effect of convincing you that what I say is worth thinking about. of course, might not have this effect. Okay, so what is the case with respect to the locutionary activities of providing theodicies and defenses of the kind talked about above? What are philosophers of religion actually doing when they engage in theodical reasoning? And what consequences does this kind of reasoning have? So here, I refer back to what I said at the outset, namely, that analytic philosophy of religion over the past 50 years has overwhelmingly concerned itself with defending the rational permissibility of religious belief in the face of secular and atheist challenges to the contrary. Thus, theodicies have tended to be evaluated on the basis of their effectiveness in countering the epistemic challenges posed by contemporary forms of the problem of evil, and preserving the rationality or reasonableness of religious belief. Of course, in the face of secular challenges. So, although sometimes referred to as justifications or defenses of God, the function of theodicy in these contexts, as suggested by the Milton quote above, is a justification of God to men. And it has been predominantly men in these contexts. In other words, an attempt to ultimately justify or defend belief in the propositions of classical theism against the skeptics. The problem of evil is posed as an abstract problem demanding an abstract solution. And for both sides of the argument, human suffering merely provides data for the crucial premise. But neither side really considers the particular suffering of real individuals, nor do they technically need to, given the debate's extremely restricted epistemic perlocutionary goals. However, if it should turn out that the doxastic, epistemic, or rhetorical perlocutionary bonuses of the theodical approach are outweighed by other moral and epistemic considerations, then even if a particular theodicy were successful in persuading the other side, which it's usually not, or at least in satisfying the side that's giving it, hell, even if a particular theodicy turned out unbeknownst to us to be true, we might still have overriding reason to rethink what we're doing in analytic philosophy of religion when we engage in theodical reasoning. And something exactly like this is what anti-theodicy philosophers tend to claim. So they argue that traditional theodical approaches are morally problematic and exhibit a kind of insensitivity or moral blindness to genuine human suffering, insofar as they attempt to abstractly transform that suffering into a necessary evil that serves some greater purpose or good, be it the realization of the best of all possible worlds, the creation of opportunities for virtuous soul-making or intimacy with the divine, punishment of bad acts of human free will, or the result of some other divine reason we can't fathom given our limited cognitive capacities. Such justifications of God, the anti-theodicist claims, add to the amount of harm in the world as opposed to alleviating it, insofar as they get God off the hook at the cost of failing to recognize suffering as inherently bad or condemnable. As Toby Bettinson put it, quote, "In responding to the problem of evil by constructing a justification of God's permission of terrible evil, theodicies think the morally unthinkable, they sanction the unsanctionable, they justify the unjustifiable. Theodicies render okay what should not be rendered okay." Or as Nick Trakakis puts it, theodicies mediate a praxis that sanctions evil. Now, as you've probably surmised, I kind of share the concerns of many anti-theodicy scholars and activists, and have over time become really dissatisfied with the way in which genuine human suffering is treated in theodical discourse, especially the theodical discourse in analytic philosophy of religion. In fact, I've come to suspect that many, maybe even most, of the theodicies in mainstream analytic philosophy of religion stem from a place of relative privilege. We should not forget that it is a luxury to be able to be in a cognitive and emotional position, right, to be able to distance ourselves from the horrors of the world in a way sufficient to be able to consider the suffering from the abstract and supposedly objective vantage point required by academic theodicy. And while the ability to academically dissociate oneself in such a way in the interest of objectivity can be beneficial in some scholarly discourse, I worry that in the case of theodicy, the persistent attempt to take up a God's eye view of suffering in the service of justification of religious belief may do more harm than good, both to the character of the academic theodicist herself and to those who are undergoing or who have undergone existentially significant suffering. So let me explain a little bit. First, the theodical approach fails morally when it has the perlocutionary effect of telling or implying to those suffering that their pain and trauma is a necessary consequence of divinely sanctioned evil. This is not just a matter of disinterested or dispassionate scholastic abstraction, but of an unwillingness to consider the negative impact and even re-traumatizing potential that such theorizing may have on those who actually suffer. Further, the theodical approach can be morally harmful to the character of the theodicist herself, insofar as it contributes to the vicious tendency that many of us have to ignore suffering or to engage in practices that desensitize to us. So this is what German theologian Dorothee Sölle called Verdummung and Desensibilisierung. Of course, the moral aspect of the issue is really closely tied in this case to the epistemic dimension as well. In fact, even for those scholars who think that the discourse concerning theodicy is, or at least in the academic sphere, ought to be, a predominantly epistemic exercise, there are offsetting worries about perlocutionary effects that might make even them rethink the approach. As Gustavo Gutierrez has pointed out in his absolutely wonderful reading of the book of Job, a friend of mine, Michelle Panchuk, turned me on to this just recently. It's fantastic. Go out there, buy it today, download it to your Kindle. It's really good. So as Gutierrez points out, the traditional theological and philosophical approach fails to listen to and take seriously the voices and experiences of those who actually suffer. It presumes to speak of God without understanding or lending credibility to the testimony of those most affected by such speech. It may thus be epistemically harmful insofar as it ignores or downplays credible sources of testimony in favor of explanations aimed at defending and protecting divine perfection at all costs, which may lead to the development of distorted beliefs and narratives about what it is and what it means to really suffer. Thus, such an approach may be more likely to lead to false beliefs about actual particular flesh and blood human beings in the service of saving the hypothetical consistency of classical theism. It may also serve to gaslight those who suffer by causing them to call into question the very nature of their experience. Granted, traumatic experience is often characterized by a fundamental lack of understanding of what one has undergone and why. But when one's most basic understanding of oneself as genuinely innocent and unnecessarily suffering, when this understanding is undermined by the theodical translation of gratuitous into necessary evils, it is not clear that scholarly theodicy itself can remedy the existential lack of understanding at the center of traumatic suffering. And Gutierrez does a fantastic job of talking about the way in which Job's friends present the theological view, and Job has to call this into question now that he's had these experiences, right? He calls things into question on the basis of something that looks very much like an argument from experience in a kind of Alstonian or Plantingian sense. I'm very excited to kind of explore this possibility more, but that's for another time. So bringing these two threads together, philosophical theodicy may serve to propagate a form of epistemic injustice, to channel Miranda Fricker, that both fails to take seriously the testimony of certain agents as credible sources of knowledge concerning human suffering, and that constructs an insular theological framework from which many such agents are no longer able to recognize their own lived experience. Yet if the limited doxastic profits of the theodical strategy, the output of which is always hypothetical, are outweighed or undermined by the actual harms, both epistemic and moral, it may cause to both victims of horrendous suffering and those theorizing about it, what are philosophers of religion to do? Should we all just go home, give up our day jobs? Maybe. Maybe not. In the time that remains today, I want to sketch out a kind of alternative approach. And basically what it does is it calls for a shift in perspective from the attempt at the purely theoretical God's eye view to that of the existential and religious situations of those who really suffer, to the perspective of Job. And from the epistemic status of religious belief to the practical situatedness of lived experience. For although suffering is a universal problem, it can only be responded to in the particular. The fact of suffering is shared, but its manifestations are irreducibly specific, even where they are collective. Thus, we might do better to think less about the rhetorical gains achieved by particular theodicies and more about their practical or therapeutic effectiveness for those persons struggling with faith in the face of suffering. To put it a bit differently, we may, with Gutierrez, ask the question which he thinks is Job's question, namely, how are human beings to find a language applicable to God in the midst of innocent suffering? But this is a question for us as philosophers and theologians too, and not just for Job. How can the religious imagination productively construe God in ways that are both appropriate to what God is and which takes account of concrete situations, of lived experience, of, as Gutierrez puts it, the sufferings and hopes of human beings? Thus, the question becomes less about how well an abstract characterization of suffering can square the divine attributes of classical theism with the extent of human suffering, and more about how practically valuable our theologically and scripturally grounded imaginings of God and God's relation to creation might be with respect to reconciling the life of faith with the very real effects of particular suffering. This, I contend, is a project of theodicy, perhaps not for a scientific age, but for a global age. Yet it is theodicy reappropriated to represent the dynamic, diachronic, and irreducibly plural struggle by which human beings wrestle with the problem of lived faith, the experience of suffering, and the witnessing to evil. From a philosophical standpoint, what is needed is a deep and meaningful analysis of the Jacob-esque process by which we grapple with the divine and with each other in the face of human suffering, and the ways in which we may thereby be transformed, for better, or in some cases perhaps even for worse. The perspectival shift I am suggesting, in which theodicy is evaluated therapeutically rather than merely epistemically, calls for innovative ways of thinking about the problem of suffering. It asks us to relinquish our attempts to generate justificatory reasons from the perspective of the abstracted divine in favor of imaginatively taking up the standpoint of Job in his concrete suffering. And something like this is what Nehama Verbin does in a recent article in which she discusses three kinds of Job: a Maimonidean Job, a Kierkegaardian Job, and a Hasidic-inspired Job. These three knights of faith, as she calls them, channeling Kierkegaard, all overcome the suffering they endure in different ways. So she calls the Maimonides-inspired Job a knight of wisdom, in which the individual views her suffering as a form of deep ignorance to be overcome, not via the acquisition of just like more facts or more propositional knowledge, but rather through mystical knowledge acquired via contemplation of the divine. Gutierrez also focuses a lot on mystical contemplation. The Kierkegaardian Job, on the other hand, whom Verben calls the knight of loving trust, does not deny the existence of her suffering. So it's not just mere ignorance to be remedied, but rather is something that, through no choice of her own, is central to her life and her self-understanding. This Job, Verben claims, recognizes that the continued life of faith may actually increase one's own suffering, insofar as faith in the face of suffering entails a paradoxical and dissonant struggle in which the individual both, quote, breaks with the world and at the same time remains within it, end quote. You could see Kierkegaard just bleeding through, right? He thus does not cease to suffer, this Job, but nevertheless transforms his suffering. He, quote, overcomes his loss by hanging on to God. Finally, Verben herself construes a third, more Hasidically inspired Job as a knight of protest, a figure of resilience who, quote, defeats the suffering of an injustice by naming the injustice an injustice, by resisting it, by protesting against it, and by refusing to be reconciled by it or with it. This third Job may forgive God for the evil he has suffered, but he remains unwilling or unable to be reconciled with the divine. Now, what I find noteworthy about this way of doing theodicy, this presentation of the problem and the possible responses it gives to suffering, is twofold. First, it shifts the perspective from God to Job and from the epistemic, propositional, and cognitive to the existential, affective, and volitional. Second, it forgoes a single universal explanation in favor of a plurality of particular construals, all of which Verben thinks can stand side by side. They can be embraced from the standpoint of philosophical analysis, she argues, insofar as each gives voice to various manifestations of religious responses to suffering that themselves, quote, render perspicuous the grammar of faith, end quote. Indeed, they reveal faith as fundamentally multifaceted, which, while not surprising, might not be the impression one would get from much of the analytic philosophical literature, though that's starting to change some. These perspectives can also be embraced, Verben claims, from a religiously committed standpoint, not in the sense of cognitively assenting to each of the propositions each of these approaches would entail, but rather in the sense of, quote, embracing or at least seriously considering the values that each of them embodies. Nevertheless, even, or perhaps especially, well, wait, we'll get to the pictures in a second. Even or perhaps especially when shifting our focus from God to Job, we must not lose sight of the dangerousness of theodicy. Indeed, theodicy construed as struggle is risky in at least three ways. On the one hand, it risks speaking problematically of God. On the other, it risks speaking problematically of human suffering. And in between these two ways of speaking, it may speak problematically of the relationship between the human and the divine. So much depends on how we speak when we speak, and when we are silent to listen or reflect. So take, for example, Verben's 3 knights. I have issues with all of them, at least construed on a certain reading. So regarding the Maimonidean Knight of Wisdom, we might worry that characterizing someone's suffering as merely a matter of some ignorance that needs to be corrected threatens to fail to take the standpoint of the suffering individual seriously and has the potential to contribute to the testimonial injustice society often inflicts on victims. Likewise, the Kierkegaardian knight of loving trust who remains in but not of the world by hanging on to an unfathomable God might sound like it is suggesting a victim of abuse to return to her abuser. Finally, encouraging unwavering protest or moral hatred of God's very self, as opposed to, for example, God's actions, may close oneself off to the possibility of forgiveness, reconciliation, or divine intimacy in ways that merely serve to add to one's suffering as opposed to overcoming it. Each of these construals may understand God or suffering in ways that are harmful, both to the person undergoing suffering and to the relationship between that person and God. On the other hand, construed slightly differently, each of Verban's nights presents one way of becoming reoriented with respect to one's suffering, whether it be cognitively, affectively, or volitionally. For example, although it may be extremely damaging to construe someone who has undergone destructive suffering as merely lacking some relevant knowledge or wisdom, there is a sense, as I mentioned earlier, in which traumatic suffering itself is characterized by a lack of comprehension and or comprehensibility. Traumatic events often cause a radical break in an individual's self-understanding, an interruption in her self-narrative, resulting in an inability to be able to make sense of herself and the world around her. The epistemic consequence of this may be a form of suffering that has a lack of understanding at its very core. And in this sense, one's reflections on the divine nature and the role one assigns it in the story of one's suffering can bring meaning to one's cognitive, affective, and volitional chaos in the attempt to reestablish a self-narrative, which is kind of one of the things that some people who are working on trauma therapy engage in, trying to remember as opposed to relive, and so on and so forth. So this could assist in those kinds of endeavors. It may also assist in promoting a kind of acceptance, not of the suffering one has undergone or the evils one has endured, but of the fact that one will always, in some sense, occupy a space that others lacking such a narrative will not. One may come to accept that one will, like Kierkegaard's Job, always have one foot in the world and one outside it. In other words, like the Night of Loving Trust, one may have to give oneself over to a narrative that affirms a break with the world, precisely in order to remain within it. Yet neither of these approaches requires that the role God plays in such a narrative be the one that absolves the divine of its role in one's suffering. The narrative contemplation of the divine by the night seeking wisdom may, as with Verban's Hasidic Job, lead her to the conclusion that she has, quote, suffered an unjust divine assault against her, a divine abuse, end quote. Indeed, the loving trust required of such a night might not be that of placing unwavering faith in God, but rather that of coming to love and trust herself by trusting her own narrative, by hanging on to, but not absolving, a God who is a perpetrator. In this way, then, there is always room for the night of protest, who, in the burdensome wisdom unfairly inflicted upon her through her experience of suffering, and with renewed trust in herself, asserts her theodical narrative precisely by refusing to be reconciled with the kind of God who hurts the objects of God's love. Love. Okay, now pictures. I want to conclude with a few thoughts on where this leaves philosophy and theology, as well as where it might leave God. Importantly, when theodicy is transformed in the way I am suggesting, it puts philosophy and theology in a role we're not exactly used to. We are used to presuming and speaking, right? Assuming for the sake of argument and holding forth. Yet, this approach asks us to wait and listen. It demands of those of us in positions of relative privilege to first be silent before we speak, to become, as Gutierrez puts it, quote, a speech that has been enriched by silence, end quote. This requires of philosophy and theology, and of the rest of us, to develop virtues of stillness and patience, of epistemic humility with regard to an experience beyond our ken, of lending credibility to voices other than our own. In this sense, then, theodicy asks us to cultivate compassion. Importantly, however, compassion is not the same as pity. It is not even the same as empathy. We are not asked to feel what others feel. This might be impossible. Neither are we asked to feel sorry for them. What is demanded is what the medieval mystics called compassio, a feeling with, or in my preferred language, feeling alongside of those who suffer. This is importantly not merely a passive state, a feeling one merely has. It is something that one actively cultivates and shows and does. It fights against passivity, against our tendency to become, as Zola put it, stultified and desensitized, to become numb to others' suffering. This problem, which has both moral and epistemic dimensions, is another way of understanding what might be wrong with the praxis of philosophical theodicy in the abstract. In contrast, not only can compassionate theodicy serve moral interests, but it is also a key component in pursuing the epistemic goal of understanding. Thus, in this way, compassion is an affective complex that very much underscores the love and pursuit of wisdom that philosophy has at its core. In this sense, then, although in philosophy we tend to proceed as though we must first locate the true propositions that make appropriate our emotions and inform our actions, it might be that what is ultimately required goes the other way around. We must listen and feel and act in order that we may understand. Anselm's fides quaerens intellectum is not just a matter of trying to piece together propositions in the right kinds of way, like a giant puzzle. With Anselm, we must feel first and pray. We must listen and contemplate. We must stand with others in solidarity and fight where we can with the tools we have at our disposal, including our analytic philosophical tools. Fides must be something we do. And when we do it, that's when revelation occurs. That's the most theological I'm going to get today. That is where we find God. We may find ourselves experimenting with religious imaginings along the way, finding some more helpful and beneficial than others, submitting them to the test of personal experience, and ridding ourselves of those idolatrous images that do more harm than good to God's creatures. Thus, the God in therapeutic theodicy is a God who awaits imaginative and narrative rediscovery. While from a theological standpoint, the transcendence and inexplicability of the divine idea may put God out of the reach of human understanding, the dynamic struggle of theodicy must wrestle with the way we imaginatively represent God in the life of faith on the ground, and what these representations mean for how we react to and respond to suffering in the world. What do our imaginings of God convey about the way we understand the world and our relationships to each other? How do certain religious concepts and narratives serve to reinforce oppressive structures and practices? How are those persons whom religion should afford comfort and protection affected by these imaginings? And how might we adapt or complicate our concepts of and narratives involving God to appropriately address those who suffer? And here we have one of my favorite religious themes, the Johannesminne, or love of John, which we see around 14th century Swabia most predominantly, kind of the area that I'm in. Absolutely touching, beautiful. Right, so this kind of grappling may allow us to meet the challenge put by Zola at the end of her book on suffering. She writes, "We can change the social conditions under which human beings are affected by suffering. We can change ourselves and learn in suffering instead of becoming worse. We can, bit by bit, beat back and countermand the suffering that even today is produced for the profit of a few. But on all these paths, we run up against limits that cannot be transcended. Death is not the only such barrier. There is also becoming dumbed down, Verdummung, and desensitized, Desensibilisierung. There is mutilation and injury, Verletzung, that cannot be undone. The only way of overcoming these limits is to share the pain of those suffering with or alongside of them, not to leave them alone, and to make their cries louder. This, I think, is one of the tasks philosophy of religion in our age can come to accept. Thank you.
That's a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. So I have a question about, so two things. One question is, in how far would you go along with the potential implication that we should all stop doing analytic philosophy and do liberation theology instead? Analytic liberation theology. We've seen a talk about that at Notre Dame. And relatedly, a philosopher of religion could say, well, your talk proves that there is no such thing as intrinsic problematicness, if that's a word, of free will theodicy or soul building. If I do it appropriately with lots of sensitivity for those who suffer, I can still do my soul building theodicy. So, I mean, that's kind of my question. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I mean, with respect to the first question, like, should we all just stop doing analytic philosophy of religion and start doing liberation theology? I mean, my view is like, why not do both? And I think we have certain ideas about what APR, analytic philosophy of religion, is supposed to be. And I think that those ideas can and ought to change. So one of my big projects right now is really to kind of push the limits of what I think analytic philosophy of religion can do. I think that the Germans like to make the distinction between like theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy, and while the distinction is sometimes less than clear, certainly analytic philosophy of religion does not fall down or fall out on the practical side at all, or nearly at all. So I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more of like what Terence Cuneo is doing, talking about philosophy of liturgy, philosophy of religious practice, religion on the ground, and so on. And so I do think that it's worth making some expansions in philosophy of religion. But it doesn't mean that we all just have to like stop what we've been doing and do something different. And I do think with Samir, for example, Samir Yadav, that analytic philosophy of religion could really provide something for liberation theology. I think there could be really good mutual interactions there. But that goes to your second question, which is, isn't it possible to do theodicy as long as one is like appropriately sensitive and nice and contextual? And I'm torn on this question personally. On the one hand, what I tend to say in the stuff that I do is, look, if you're part of kind of old school analytic philosophy of religion, you can keep on doing what you're doing, that's fine. I just want to do this other stuff over here. And at the moment, I'm happy with that, but I'm not sure I should be. And I do think that we have to ask ourselves if we agree that these practices can be harmful in the ways that I've outlined or in some other kinds of ways, might that speak against doing it at all? And I still don't know what to say about that. What I do want to say is that if you really like metaphysicking around in philosophy of religion, and doing kind of the puzzling aspect and stuff, a lot of the things that I want to explore with respect to the religious imagination and religion as play and so on, allow for you to still do that kind of fun metaphysicking around. But I do think it's worth always kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, but when we're doing this, what are we doing and what kinds of effects do these have? And so that's not a very helpful answer at this point, but it's something I'm still kind of thinking about myself, so thank you.
So I'm just wondering with speech acts, so it does, I mean, the moral character of a speech act does vary a lot on the basis of context. So I'm thinking, so suppose Mikwai suppose he's made a total mess of his life and it's all his fault. And there might obviously be contexts where I could sort of, with Mikwai, it might be very insensitive for me to go on and on about how it's his fault and discuss all the very complex and interesting ways in which this is so, and really this might could also have lots of negative perlocutionary effects, and I don't know so much about elocution reactions, but it could be the wrong sort of those. Is it necessarily the case that, if I'm trying to work out how to avoid similarly messing up my own life, then maybe there are contexts where it's appropriate for me in private to reflect on, or, with Ralph, when we're trying to work out how to avoid Mikwai's fate, well, which part of that was Mikwai's fault? We've got to be aware of that. And then this thing which would be really insensitive if we were talking to Mikwai, it's not so insensitive if we're talking about it where Mikwai is not there, depending on how we talk about it and so on. So I'm just wondering that those kinds of distinctions seem to become really important if some kinds of parallel concerns can make traditional theodicy problematic. The concerns would be, is it actually harming people? Are those people listening? How's the conversation? In what manner is the conversation being conducted? Is it being conducted in a sort of callous manner, or are people being treated as sort of, look, here, let's think of another really great example of suffering, isn't this exciting, and so on, without a proper sense of propriety, and so. So I'm just, do you think that those kinds of contextual considerations are very important for the sort of practical considerations that you're raising about the appropriateness of theodicy?
I think to some extent I can say sort of what I just said to Helen, which is that, this is something I'm still kind of working out, but it strikes me that if it turns out that a practice is, so just in general, if it turns out that a certain practice is potentially really, really harmful, it might be worth not engaging in that practice, even when you can get away with it and not harm anybody. But because it cultivates bad dispositions and tendencies and so on. But the thing about, whose fault it is, done behind closed doors, I suppose. I don't know. Let's put it this way. I think what I would minimally advocate is that you first take, sorry, what was the name again? Mikwai. I apologize.
He has been in his life,
that you take his testimony at least seriously and as a potential source of credible knowledge. So if right off the bat you kind of do this yeah, but we know what he's like, whether you do it explicitly or implicitly, right? Maybe don't mean to be that way, but you're just yeah, you know how he is. That then he has no opportunity to contribute to your evaluation of his situation, even as it may apply to your own case. And so this whole idea of listening, of opening up a space for people to speak and taking that seriously first, I think is really important. So that's kind of the minimal deal. Then there's the question of how many people listen to philosophers? Maybe I'm grossly overestimating the effect that we have on the public at large. But if, as I do, if you understand philosophy as a fundamentally public enterprise, then and especially theology as well, and community of believers, community of the faithful, then you're never in the bubble, right? And you have to keep that in consideration. And second, we find theodicies of these very sorts being trotted out in churches by pastors doing real harm to real people. And so it really isn't, the work that Michelle Panchuk and others are doing on religious trauma right now and the way that people are traumatized by members of their very religion that they trust through sometimes theodicies like these, that's bad. And insofar as any of our discourse contributes to that, we got to think about that. We got to think real hard about that. So, yeah.
Sam, I need you to give me an order, or I'll go from the back forward. Yeah, that's what I was estimating.
I'm planning to carry on just right where we left off, which is great. Thank you so much. What I wanted to ask is, when you take people's views seriously, what do you do when their views of God are absolutely mutually exclusive from each other. So for example, the one person says, you know, what gets you through? Well, it's the belief that God is absolutely in control of everything, that this happens for my good. You know, God absolutely intended this. And then the next person takes, you know, an open theist route or a process theist route, says, you know, the only hope is in God never intending any of this, not being able to stop it in any way, shape, or form. So, I mean, what constitutes success? Is it simply that people feel better? And in that case, is this just a chase after a placebo? So, I mean, I'm asking this because I'm doing exactly the same project. So these are the things I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because it's a question that I'm struggling with myself. I think we do have to be careful with respect to paternalism and kind of being like, well, you know, you have this view, but like this view of God that like God, you know, it's all good for you and it will all turn out in the end and stuff. And maybe you shouldn't have that because it's bad, you know. And there's part of me that wants to say that, but I don't know. The other thing I should say here is also like I'm not a therapist, and I think that somebody who is engaged psychologically with those who have undergone serious trauma, for example, has a better idea of which things are kind of healthier than others, perhaps. But that aside, there's also another worry lurking, which is like the threat of crazy relativism. You know, it's all you know, the whole like, you know, first semester philosophy student, true for you, true for me kind of thing. Like there's this threat there, and I see that, and I'm worried about that. One of the projects that I'm engaged in, kind of as a broader thing, deals with the religious imagination, trying to move past the realism question, like which God is correct or true or whatever, and towards a more kind of pragmatic understanding. But it's still a community. Right? I mean, religion involves the social, it involves a community, and it involves then a social negotiation of which terms are acceptable, heretical, and so on. And then you have the individual who's struggling, and how do you reconcile those two when when the individual's image of God doesn't match up with the community's? I mean, what that calls for is it calls for a renegotiation of the imaginative space. It calls for dialogue. And so what we need are, you know, we need to think about good strategies for productive dialogue. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that answers your worry. And I'm not sure it answers mine either. And at some point, I may just have to bite the bullet and say, look, in cases where it really does help a person, wouldn't God want that? You know, wouldn't God rather have a false image in someone's mind of God and have one of God's creatures doing better overall? I mean, that seems right to me, but.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really just wanted to follow up the kind of line of questioning that's already been developed. Towards the end of your paper, you just hinted that beginning from asking what sort of language is applicable to God out of an actual situation of suffering might lead us to rethink images of God. So the question really is this a challenge actually to the whole analytic tradition of perfect being and a certain conception of the attributes of God? And if that is so, is your strategy of complementarity, in other words, you know, in one situation I will pursue an analytic approach of the perfect being, in another situation I will think more about actual practices of suffering, is that satisfactory? I mean, should you not, as a philosopher, therefore be asking more radical questions about the nature of God, for example, about the classical divine attributes? So I'm really asking where you're going, as it were, in this direction. In other words, are you really wanting to become more of a theologian than an analytic philosopher? Because on the whole, theology has diverged in recent years from perfect being, language, and concepts. So it's really, I think, your strategy here. Are you aiming, as it were, as a philosopher, as an analytic philosopher, to rethink questions of perfect being and a certain view of divine attributes?
The short answer is yes. Secretly, or now not so secretly. I think classical theism is overrated, and I think we can do better. And I think we could do like morally better. Epistemically, I don't know. I mean, I think setting things up as like, which is the right account, which is closer to the truth and so on, that's kind of a view I'm trying to move away from this kind of realist, anti-realist debate. So I am moving in a very, broadly speaking, pragmatic direction, which is which imaginings of God are most useful. And then we have to talk about for what and for what purposes. And I'm working on that, but I'm not there yet. But I think those are questions for analytic philosophy of religion and or analytic theology. So to go at the other aspect of the question, like philosophy, you know, one hat, theology, the other, one of my beefs with analytic philosophy of religion is that it looks too much like analytic theology. So I think we need a genuine comparative philosophy of religion. I think we need more voices from non-Christian traditions, more voices from non-white privileged males. I think we need more voices in analytic philosophy of religion. I also think it should become philosophy of religion and not just philosophy of classical theism. So those are kind of like my big, giant aims. At the same time, I'm not a huge fan of disciplinary policing. Everybody talks about interdisciplinary work and how we want to, have interdisciplinary research, and yet at the end of the day, we just keep dividing ourselves up and like, oh, the theologians do this, and the philosophers do this, and the cognitive scientists do this, and religious studies is over here somewhere. And I would like to see less policing of disciplinary boundaries and more kind of work on mutual projects. Of course, we got to figure out what those projects are going to be. But if they were a little bit more public and a little less like sitting around puzzling about stuff, which is fun, I dig it. But if it were a little bit more kind of applicable, applied, something like that, I would welcome that kind of endeavor.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I'm very, very sympathetic to everything that you said, pretty much. But I just wanted to risk flipping the coin a bit on the therapy aspect of it. So might you not think that for those who are undergoing the suffering, seeing it as some way justified might have precisely the therapeutic effect of alleviating the suffering to some extent or to some degree. Isn't it therefore the case that, or at least conceivable, that one might have, some sort of duty to defend it as such for that benefit? So, for example, you might think that Sam has failed at his life profoundly. And there's no redemption to be had. From the third person perspective, you can see it's just all a complete shambles. But rather than telling Sam, well, there's no redemption to be had, now you just have to wallow in the utter despair of the situation you have gotten yourself into, and maybe draw some consolation from the fact that it is real, I might say, well, actually, Sam, it does fit into a larger whole from which you might draw some consolation about your ruined life. At least others can learn by example, or something like that. Or even better, it fits into God's plan. So even if we take the sort of even Karamazov approach that, you know, this is utterly unjustifiable and subjectively I can't allow myself to be part of this, for the benefit of others who we clearly see that might, you know, be able to somehow feel a bit better about it all and understand it as something that makes sense in a larger picture, wouldn't that be, you know, something that could have that therapeutic effect as well?
So, I mean, to a certain extent, this goes back to the worry, the pluralistic kind of relativistic worry, which is, well, look, the classical theists can just launch now a pragmatic argument and say, yeah, but our theodicies can be beneficial too. And certainly for some people do find some comfort in various theodicies. Certainly people find eschatological comfort in the idea that all will be well. And there's a theodicy lurking in the background there. So, you know, certainly in some circles, I think especially in certain evangelical circles, theodicies do, or people do find comfort in what we might call the traditional, you know, theodicies. And so first of all, it's an empirical question, right? Who is helped, who is harmed, how big is it? What we also do see is that I think that there are, I would venture to say that there are whole swaths of persons who are really genuinely hurt by these things. And we can't really make it a question of numbers, like, you know, if the majority is helped, but like a small minority, or like a fairly large minority is harmed or something, you know, it gets a little worrisome, and it goes back to the question from before as well. And this is, I guess maybe this is where I get a little paternalistic, and I think like, yeah, but these things really don't give you a good, morally good view of the world. But I'm not sure that's satisfactory. And so this troubles me as well. I don't want to tell somebody if they find comfort in a traditional theodicy that's like, stop doing that, you know, accuse God more, you know. But certainly what we do see is we see a lot of people to whom certain theodicies are being addressed explicitly, whose experience speaks against those kinds of theodicies, and who are certainly harmed. And I don't know. Yeah, sorry. We have
a question from Malia.
I was just going to jump in and add then, of course, for those who don't know, last time we met, we had Paul Lodge relevantly defending what I think you might describe as a kind of anti-theodical reading of Leibniz's theodicy, which you might think is sort of the least likely contender, but...
Yeah, so actually, maybe there are ways of also, you know, having your cake and eating it too, in the sense of reformulating classical theodicies in ways that are less harmful. And that might go to your question about context as well. So maybe that's something that one could engage in, to say, look, we can still save some of this stuff that's informed our theology for so long, but we have to mold it or present it or talk about it in such and such a way or something like that.
I agree, theodicy can be done very badly, and a phrase I personally hate as a pastor is God has a plan. I have a loathing of that, right? But what discovered great comfort, both myself and sometimes to others, is that God dynamically rewrites the plan. And that's the great story of Christianity, is any situation can be redeemed. And there's so many rich stories. The thief on the cross. And heck, we crucified God. If you take Christianity seriously, we crucified God. How do you get back from that situation? That seems like nothing else. That seems like the worst. You know, we were well ahead of Nietzsche on that one. And you know, that does give comfort. So although I agree it can be done very badly, I also think that some of the comforts you get from these things are not available anywhere else. Thank you.
Thanks. So part of the larger project that I'm really wanting us to engage in is to really consider kind of the imaginings of God that we have, and this kind of dynamic, redemptive God. First of all, it's not clear to me that that's consistent with classical theism. Yeah, I know. It might be, but I have issues with special divine action, despite having written on it. Yeah, so one of the things that I'm really interested in, though, is exactly how we can, it's not just like we need to come up with these radically new approaches that come out of nowhere, right? In fact, it is my considered view that the images of God that we land on should have some, they should be continuous with the tradition in some relevant sense. They should be recognizable. I think historically grounded imaginings. I mean, this is why I really like the Johannesminne kind of idea, because it's a 14th century theme, but it's something that I think really speaks to us today. And it can be an image that can be easily reappropriated, or Guido Roche's tortured Christ, right? Here we have a Christ who is obviously non-white. We have someone who is crying out in extreme pain, potentially accusatory, angry, right? You know, when we combine these kinds of historical and contemporary imaginings of what the divine can be, we might come up with something that is ultimately very comforting and very helpful. And so this idea of redemption is something that, you know, we don't just want to throw it out. The question is how to, you know, incorporate it best into a kind of theology that speaks to those and with those who suffer. Also, I forget who it was I was talking to, but the idea that there has to be some sort of kind of eschatology in the background of some sort, or some sort of salvific idea is interesting to me. Especially if you take seriously what I think it's Michael Sturbar has written about the possibility of non-redemptive suffering, suffering that cannot be made good. And if there's something like that that's real, and I'm inclined to think that there might be something like that, then a redemption theology is only going to go so far. So yeah, but thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have rather overrun our official question time, but we would invite you to have another drink with us after we finish. This is, of course, the last meeting of the Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre Seminar Series of this year, so we'd like to thank again the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw for supporting this series. And we'd also like to ask you to thank once again our speaker, Amber Griffioen, for a really rich talk today. Thank you.